The desert sun beat down mercilessly, baking the sand beneath Elias McCord's boots as he stood alone, his breath shallow, dust clinging to the sweat on his neck. Around him, a perfect circle of mounted Apache warriors tightened, their horses restless, hooves stirring up clouds of grit that turned the air into a haze. 100 feathers rose skyward, each warrior lifting a hand in solemn defiance, their dark eyes fixed on the lone cowboy who had dared step into their world. Elias's hat brim cast a shadow over his face, but it couldn't hide the tension etched into his jaw. He knew this wasn't about cattle, or land, or even revenge. This was about trust and whether his single act of sacrifice had meaning to them. The memory of the night before clawed its way into his thoughts. He could still see Nantan, the young Apache woman lying wounded near the creek, her blood soaking into the dirt, her breath fragile like a dying ember. He had found her by chance, or perhaps fate, and without hesitation had done the unthinkable. He slit the reins of his own horse, pressed the animal forward, and let her ride while he stumbled beside them. His horse had carried her to safety, but the cost was his own freedom. Alone in the desert, he had walked until dawn, every step heavier than the last. Now, as the warriors encircled him, he wondered if they knew. Did Taza, the towering leader with braids streaked by years of battle, understand that the stranger before him had given up his only lifeline for one of their own? Or would they see him only as another trespasser, another white man on Apache ground, guilty before he even opened his mouth? Elias kept his hands loose at his sides, aware that the wrong move could ignite violence in a heartbeat. From the line of warriors, Little Hawk's voice broke the silence. Sharp, accusing, it carried across the circle. Why would a cowboy spill his blood for an Apache? The question hung in the heat, sharper than any blade. Some of the warriors shifted uneasily, their feathers trembling in the wind. Elias didn't answer right away. Words would mean little. Out here, a man was judged by his actions, not his tongue. Still, his throat burned with the need to speak the truth. Chenoa, the elder, urged her horse a step forward. Her voice, softer but commanding, cut through the rising tension. Let him speak. Her gaze locked onto Elias, searching, weighing the worth of his soul. Behind her, Nantan's fragile form appeared, supported by 2 riders. Her eyes, still weak but burning with recognition, fell on him, and the faintest smile tugged at her lips. The circle held its breath. Dust swirled in the golden air, time stretched taut, and Elias McCord finally knew the moment had come. His sacrifice had carried him to the edge of life and death, and now the truth, or the silence, would decide if he left this desert alive. The day before the circle of warriors closed in on him, Elias McCord had been a man of habit. The morning sun had risen over the dry plains, painting the ranch fences in streaks of gold while he tightened the last nail into a warped board. His hands, scarred and blistered from years of work, moved without thought, the rhythm of a man used to solitude. He paused only to take in the distant mountains, their blue silhouettes promising freedom and danger alike. The ranch dog barked once at the horizon, sensing movement Elias could not yet see. Life had always been about survival out here, repairing fences, tending cattle, mending saddles. But that day carried a weight he couldn't name. He saddled his horse, the animal's hide gleaming in the light, and rode toward Dry Creek to fetch water. The land around him smelled of leather, dust, and mesquite. Every creak of his saddle, every crunch of hooves against brittle earth reminded him of the emptiness he had grown used to. Passing through town wasn't in the plan, but Elias felt the pull of the saloon, the sound of distant laughter carried by the wind. He avoided it, steering his horse toward the quieter trail that cut near the old trading post. Something about the silence unsettled him, like a whisper caught in the air, warning him that the routine of his life was about to split apart. Near the creek, he found signs of disturbance, broken reeds, a trail of blood smearing across the sand, and the imprint of a body dragged from the water's edge. Elias's chest tightened. In the distance, under the shade of cottonwoods, he spotted her, a young Apache woman, crumpled and motionless. Her name, he would later learn, was Nantan. Her breathing was faint, shallow, as though each breath might be her last. The arrow lodged in her side glistened dark against her skin. For a long moment Elias simply stood there, his horse shifting nervously behind him, as if warning that what he chose next would change everything. He thought of riding away. It wasn't his fight, wasn't his war. The border towns had always warned, keep to your kind, stay clear of Apache business, or you'd invite death. But Elias wasn't built for turning his back on the broken. He knelt by her side, pressing his hand against the wound, feeling the hot blood pulse against his palm. The woman stirred, her lips parting to whisper something he couldn't understand. Fear clawed at his gut, but so did resolve. His eyes shifted to his horse. The animal was strong, swift, the only reason Elias had managed to survive the harsh stretches of desert alone. To give it away meant surrendering his one chance at safety. Yet as he looked back at Nantan, barely clinging to life, he felt the choice gnaw at him. A man's worth, he thought, wasn't measured by the fences he mended or the cattle he raised. It was measured in moments like this, when no one was watching, and everything was on the line. By the time the sun dipped behind the canyon ridge, Elias had decided. He tied his gear to his back, guided his horse to its knees, and lifted Nantan carefully onto the saddle. The mare whinnied, as if resisting the burden, but Elias steadied her with a soft word. He slapped the reins and sent them forward, watching the dust rise as his only companion carried a stranger away from death. Alone on foot, the desert stretched before him, vast and unforgiving. He walked into the night knowing the cost of his choice and that trouble would follow with the dawn. Elias McCord trudged back from the creek with the image of Nantan burned into his mind. The night air clung cold to his skin, yet his thoughts were far from clear. He had given up his horse, the one companion he could trust, and now every step felt like penance for a choice he wasn't sure he had the right to make. Survival in the desert was hard enough with a mount, without one, it was near impossible. Still, the memory of her shallow breathing, her fragile voice whispering in a tongue he didn't understand, made turning away unthinkable. That night, Elias lay in the sand, staring up at a moon cold and watchful, wrestling with the decision that had already set his fate in motion. Morning found him sore, his boots worn raw against the rocky ground. As he walked, his mind chewed over what would come next. Men in town would call him a fool, Jed Crow most of all. Jed, the rancher with a bitter tongue, had long warned that the Apaches would never spare a man like Elias. "They'll bleed you dry if you give 'em the chance," Jed would say. And Marshal Harlan Briggs? He'd scoff at the very notion of sacrifice, caring only for order and paperwork. Yet Elias knew what they didn't. Sometimes, the lines between enemy and ally blurred when you looked close enough at suffering. By midday, he reached the trading post where Isaac Boone was bartering with a pair of drifters. Isaac's eyes narrowed when he saw Elias without his horse. "You lose your sense, McCord?" he asked, voice sharp with suspicion. "Or did you sell it for whiskey?" Elias ignored the jab, but Boone pressed harder, leaning across the counter. "Word is Apache raiders been near the creek. You cross paths with any of 'em?" The implication was clear. Boone smelled blood in the air, and gossip was his favorite currency. Elias kept silent, knowing that one wrong word would spark rumors faster than dry grass catching flame. That silence carried weight. Should he protect himself and say nothing, letting Nantan's fate remain a secret? Or should he speak the truth, risk Boone's tongue spreading it across the territory, and face whatever consequences came with it? The moral weight pressed on him heavier than the desert sun. He thought again of her weak smile, the flicker of trust in her eyes when he placed her on his horse. That moment wasn't just mercy, it was a bond sealed in blood. At the edge of town, Elias caught sight of Luzia Caraway, the Karandra who straddled two worlds. She was tending herbs in the shade, her hands steady, her eyes knowing. She met his gaze and, without asking, seemed to sense what he had done. "The desert watches, Elias," she murmured softly. "Every choice echoes louder than you think." Her words were both comfort and warning, a reminder that no decision lived in silence forever. By sundown, the decision was made, not spoken, but carried in the set of his shoulders and the steel in his stride. He would not deny what he had done, nor seek to hide it. If trouble came, so be it. For Elias McCord, the path of honor had already been chosen. He just didn't know yet how steep the cost would be. The following evening, as Elias trudged through the barren stretch of land toward his cabin, a strange unease settled over him. The wind carried more than just the smell of dust, it carried whispers of danger. From the ridge above, he thought he saw a line of riders, silhouettes against the dying sun. They were too far to identify, but the rhythm of their movement made his stomach knot. These weren't ranch hands or drifters. They moved with precision, the kind only Apache warriors carried in their bones. Elias paused, heart pounding, then forced himself forward, knowing that shadows had already found him. When he reached his cabin, the night was creeping fast. He struck a lantern and set it on the table, its flicker illuminating the worn wood and the Bible his mother had left him years before. But the light only deepened his unease. A scrap of hide had been nailed to the door, marked with black ash symbols Elias didn't understand. It was a warning, a message meant for him alone. He tore it down with a trembling hand, glancing over his shoulder as if eyes were watching. In the silence, the creak of his floorboards sounded like thunder. The next morning, word spread through town. Isaac Boone whispered to anyone who'd listened that Elias had been seen near the creek, muttering that he'd helped an Apache. By midday, the saloon buzzed with rumor, cowboys leaning back in their chairs, spitting tobacco, and shaking their heads at his foolishness. Jed Crow cornered him outside the blacksmith's shop, spitting in the dirt. "You picked your side, McCord," Jed sneered. "Don't expect us to save your hide when they come knocking." His words cut deeper than any blade. Elias realized that saving Nantan hadn't just endangered himself, it had marked him in the eyes of his own people. That afternoon, he tried to push the unease away, repairing his corral and tending to what little stock he had left. Yet every hammer strike seemed to echo against the still air, like a drumbeat marching closer. When dusk came, Elias caught another sign, a thin trail of smoke curling into the sky from the hills beyond. It wasn't the smoke of a campfire, it was a signal, and though he couldn't read it, he knew it was meant for warriors who moved unseen. Later, Luzia Caraway arrived quietly at his gate, her shawl pulled tight against the cool night air. She warned him in hushed tones that Nantan had survived the night and that word of his sacrifice had already reached her people. "Some see you as a friend," she said softly, "but others believe you've trespassed where no cowboy should." Her eyes lingered on him, filled with both sympathy and fear. Elias understood, his act of mercy had not gone unnoticed, and the storm was building faster than he could prepare for. As the crickets sang and the moon rose, Elias sat on his porch, rifle across his knees, lantern light flickering against his weary face. In the distance, he thought he heard hoofbeats, soft, deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. The warning signs were no longer whispers. Trouble was moving closer, and by dawn, it would be at his door. The night did not pass quietly. Just after midnight, the sound of horses broke through the stillness, the low thud of hooves pressing closer to Elias McCord's cabin. He rose from his chair, rifle in hand, and stepped into the cool air. Lantern light spilled across the yard, and there they were, 5 Apache riders, their faces painted in shadow and firelight. At their head was Little Hawk, his eyes sharp with suspicion, a young man hungry to prove himself. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, though he knew he couldn't outgun them all. Silence stretched between them, as tense as a drawn bowstring. Little Hawk's voice cut the night. "You," he said in broken English, pointing at Elias with the tip of his spear, "cowboy who gave away his horse." The accusation wasn't praise, it was challenge. Elias swallowed hard. He lowered his weapon, careful not to show weakness, but not daring to invite bloodshed. "I did what was right," he answered. "Your woman was dying. I couldn't just walk away." The words tasted like dust, and from the rider's narrowed eyes, he could see they weren't enough. The exchange grew harsher. One of the warriors dismounted, circling Elias like a predator testing prey. He spat at the cowboy's boots and muttered words Elias couldn't follow. Little Hawk barked something in Apache, and the others laughed, though their laughter carried no warmth. Elias felt the weight of being outnumbered, out of place, and out of time. He had expected gratitude, maybe even respect, but instead he found mistrust sharpening every glance, every gesture. They weren't there to thank him. They were there to decide if he was worth sparing. Inside, the lantern flame flickered, shadows dancing across the Bible and the walls that had seen him through countless lonely nights. For the first time, Elias wondered if his decision had been not only foolish but suicidal. He could feel their judgment heavy on his chest, the air so thick he could hardly draw breath. He thought of Nantan, of her frail smile, and clung to the hope that she might be the only bridge between him and these men who saw him as nothing but an intruder. Then, without warning, the tension snapped. One warrior lunged forward, grabbing Elias by the collar, yanking him down the steps of his own porch. Elias fought back on instinct, shoving him away, his rifle clattering to the ground. A scuffle broke out, fists flying, boots scraping against the dirt. Though he managed to push the man off, the confrontation left Elias shaken. A rifle barrel was leveled at his chest before he could stand, the moonlight glinting cold along the steel. Little Hawk raised his hand, halting the trigger's pull. His gaze bored into Elias's, testing, calculating. After a long pause, he lowered the weapon but not the threat. "This is not over," he said, his words heavy with promise. The riders mounted again, vanishing into the desert darkness as swiftly as they had come. Elias stood alone in the dust, chest heaving, blood pounding in his ears. The message was clear: the matter would not be settled quietly. A larger reckoning was on its way. Morning light crept over the desert, revealing a man more weary than wounded. Elias McCord sat on his porch, the rifle across his knees, trying to still the echo of the night before. His knuckles were raw from the scuffle, his pride more bruised than his body. He had stood against 5 Apache warriors and survived, but survival was not the same as victory. The words of Little Hawk haunted him: "This is not over." Elias knew the young warrior was right. Something larger was unfolding, and his role in it was only beginning to surface. By midday, Luzia Caraway arrived again, her shawl fluttering in the hot wind, her dark eyes lined with urgency. She carried news that made Elias's stomach tighten: Nantan had spoken his name. In her weakened state, she had told her people about the cowboy who had given away his horse and carried her from the edge of death. But there was more. Luzia's voice softened as she revealed the truth Nantan had whispered: her wound had not come from a white settler, nor from outlaws. She had been struck by one of her own during a dispute over honor and betrayal. That secret, if known widely, could tear the Apache camp apart. The revelation stunned Elias. He had believed the threat to come from the usual frontier lines: cowboys against tribes, settlers against natives. But now, the wound in Nantan's side carried the weight of a deeper fracture, one that could ignite into civil fire if exposed. He realized he wasn't merely entangled in their survival, he was tied to their politics, their rivalries, their blood feuds. "Why tell me this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Luzia's reply was steady: "Because you have already chosen your place in this story. Whether you like it or not, you are bound to her fate." That evening, Elias walked the ridge above his land, scanning the horizon. The smoke signals he had seen earlier now made sense. They weren't warnings to him, they were messages within the tribe, signals of fracture, of shifting power. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Taza, the leader, was holding council, and Nantan's survival was forcing questions that had been buried too long. Elias knew he had become a symbol, one man's sacrifice standing in the middle of a storm that wasn't his to control. As dusk fell, Jonas Whitlock, the former cavalryman, rode up to Elias's cabin. His withered face bore the guilt of old battles, and his words were as heavy as the saddle he carried. "They're watching you, McCord," Jonas warned. "You've stumbled into something bigger than cattle, bigger than land. One wrong move, and you won't just start a fight, you'll start a war." The truth lay bare now: Elias wasn't just caught between two worlds. He was the thread that could either stitch them together or unravel them entirely. When night came, Elias sat alone beneath the stars, the desert wind whispering through the scrub. The choice before him was no longer about survival. It was about truth, whether to guard the secret Nantan had entrusted, or to use it to sway her people. Either path was dangerous, but one thing was certain: whatever decision he made, it could never be undone. The days that followed blurred into a restless haze for Elias McCord. He scarcely slept, his nights haunted by the echo of hoofbeats and the sharp memory of cold steel pressed against his chest. Each dawn, he walked the perimeter of his land, rifle in hand, watching the horizon as though it might split open at any moment. The weight of Nantan's secret pressed on him heavier than the desert heat. If he revealed it, he might buy his own life, but at the cost of hers, and perhaps ignite bloodshed between factions of her own people. If he kept it, he risked being branded a liar or traitor by both sides. Either way, the desert had him cornered. One evening, as the sky bled red and gold, the first blow came. A group of townsfolk gathered at the edge of his corral, led by Jed Crow, their faces sharp with anger. "We know you've been meddling," Jed spat, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd. "You've thrown in with the Apaches, and that makes you no better than them." Elias stood silent, gripping the fence rail to keep from lunging across it. He saw suspicion in every face. Neighbors who had once tipped their hats now stared at him as if he were poison. The humiliation burned hotter than fire, and for the first time, Elias felt the sting of being cast out by his own kind. Inside the saloon later that night, Marshal Harlan Briggs confirmed the betrayal. He called Elias to the table, his eyes cold as iron. "The town can't afford your kind of trouble, McCord," the marshal said. "If the Apaches are stirring, it's because of you. One more incident, and I'll have you in irons." The words struck harder than fists. Public disgrace was bad enough, but official condemnation stripped Elias of whatever protection remained. He left the saloon under a rain of whispers, his reputation crushed under boots that once welcomed him. Out in the desert, matters were worse. Little Hawk and his band appeared again, this time with no patience left. They seized Elias outside his cabin, binding his hands with rawhide and dragging him to a rocky clearing beneath the starlight. Bruised and bloodied, he was forced to his knees before the warriors, their faces lit by fire's glow. "You think mercy buys you trust?" Little Hawk snarled. "Mercy makes you weak." They shoved him down into the dirt, the edge of a blade grazing his throat. For the first time since this began, Elias truly believed he would die. But then, like a sudden gust breaking still air, Nantan appeared, supported by 2 riders. Pale, weak, but alive, she stepped forward and placed herself between Elias and the blade. Her words, spoken in Apache, carried more weight than his life alone. He didn't understand them fully, but he saw the effect, the hesitation in the warrior's stance, the shift in their eyes. Her intervention bought him a fragile breath, but not forgiveness. He was alive for now, though stripped of all advantage. That night, as Elias lay bruised against the cold ground, the desert sky vast above him, hopelessness sank deep. Yet in that hopelessness flickered a spark. Nantan had risked herself to shield him. Why? What did she see in him that even he could not? Clinging to that thought, Elias formed the faint outline of a desperate plan. He had no certainty it would work, but he knew this: if he did nothing, both he and Nantan would be consumed by forces beyond their control. Tomorrow, he would gamble everything. The dawn that followed was heavy with silence, as if the desert itself held its breath. Elias McCord stood at the edge of the Apache encampment, bound but unbroken, his body aching from the beating he had endured. Before him sat the council fire, its flames crackling in the early light, casting long shadows across the circle of warriors. At its head, Taza, the elder leader, loomed like stone, broad-shouldered, his braids streaked with gray, his eyes sharp enough to cut through lies. This was no gathering for threats or warnings. It was judgment. And Elias knew the moment had come where words alone would decide his fate. When Taza lifted his hand, silence swept the camp. "Why would a white man give his horse, his only chance of survival, for one of ours?" he asked, his voice deep and resonant. The question carried more than curiosity, it was a test, a line drawn in the sand. Elias's throat was dry, but he forced his voice steady. "Because life is worth more than land. More than cattle. More than pride." She was dying. And no man worth the dust beneath his boots could leave her there. His words hung heavy, stirring murmurs among the circle. Some eyes softened. Others hardened like stone. But then came the twist. From the far side of the fire, Chenoa, the elder woman, rose slowly, her frail body cloaked in dignity. Her voice, though worn with age, cut sharper than steel. "The truth is heavier than his words. Nantan was not struck down by the hand of a white man. She carries the wound of her own people." Gasps rippled through the camp, warriors shifting uncomfortably. Little Hawk's eyes blazed with fury, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. The revelation cracked the air like thunder, an unspoken betrayal now laid bare before the tribe. Elias felt the ground tilt beneath him. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected their own to speak the secret aloud. Yet in that moment, he realized the truth could free him or destroy him, depending on which way the council leaned. He saw the camp divided, some whispering of honor and healing, others of shame and weakness. The fire popped, spitting sparks into the air, as if the land itself demanded a decision. Then, from among the younger warriors, a voice rose, unexpected, defiant. Little Hawk, though filled with rage, stepped forward and pointed at Elias. If this cowboy speaks of honor, let him prove it. Let him face me, not with weapons, but with truth. The challenge was not to bloodshed but to character, a duel of spirit before the eyes of every warrior present. The camp held still, the desert wind brushing through feathers and braids. Elias felt the weight of every gaze on him, of every breath waiting for his reply. This was no longer about survival. It was about trust, sacrifice, and the fragile thread binding two worlds together. As the flames danced higher, Elias lifted his chin and met Little Hawk's glare. The outcome of this moment would decide not only his life but the path of all who stood there. The campfire blazed brighter as the circle of warriors tightened, their eyes locked on Elias McCord and Little Hawk. No rifles were raised, no blades drawn, the battle that loomed was not one of steel, but of spirit. Elias stood tall, his body battered but his resolve firm, while Little Hawk's youthful fury burned hotter than the flames themselves. The silence pressed down until even the crackle of fire seemed to fade, leaving only the tension between two men who could not be more different, yet who both carried the weight of honor. Little Hawk spoke first, his voice sharp and filled with venom. "You speak of sacrifice," he spat, "but men like you have taken more from us than you could ever give. Why should your horse mean anything to us?" The question stung, but Elias did not flinch. His voice was low, steady, each word carrying the grit of the desert. "Because I gave what I could not afford to lose. I gave what meant life to me, so that she could live. That's not the act of an enemy, that's the act of a man." His words carried into the still night, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed Little Hawk's eyes. Taza, the elder leader, leaned forward, his gaze burning with authority. "And would you do it again, cowboy? Even knowing the cost, even knowing the anger it has brought?" Elias's chest tightened. The truth weighed heavily on his tongue, but he knew there was no turning back. "Yes," he said firmly, 1,000 times over. "Because a man who turns his back on the dying has no right to call himself a man." The declaration struck the circle like a hammer, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the warriors. Some nodded with quiet approval, others scowled in resistance, but the balance was shifting. Then Nantan herself stepped forward, weak yet resolute, her voice trembling but clear. "This man saved me when my own blood turned against me. He saw worth in me when others saw only a burden." She placed a trembling hand against Elias's shoulder, her eyes blazing despite her frailty. "If you call him an enemy, then I too am your enemy. And if you honor me as one of your own, then honor him as well." Her words cut deeper than any blade. For the first time, Little Hawk faltered, his rage dimming under the force of her truth. The camp fell into silence, the decision hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Taza rose to his full height, towering above them all. His deep voice rolled like thunder. "This man is not our enemy. His sacrifice speaks louder than our anger. There will be no war here tonight." The declaration split the tension wide open, and though some warriors muttered in protest, the weight of Taza's authority silenced them. Relief washed over Elias, though it was tempered with exhaustion. He had walked the edge of death and somehow stepped back alive. The community shifted that night not with cheers or celebration, but with something more enduring, a fragile respect, a bond forged in fire. The war that once seemed inevitable had been pulled back from the brink, replaced with an uneasy but lasting understanding. For the first time in days, Elias believed he might see another dawn not as an outsider, but as a man who had earned a place, however fragile, in two worlds. Weeks passed, and the dust of conflict slowly settled into memory. Elias McCord returned to the quiet rhythm of his land, though life was no longer the same. The fences he mended, the cattle he tended, even the worn Bible on his table all seemed smaller in comparison to what he had endured. His days were quieter, but not empty. At night, when the desert wind whispered through the mesquite, he thought often of the fire circle, of Nantan's trembling hand on his shoulder, and of the fragile peace that had been born in that moment. It was a memory that carried weight, a scar not on his body but on his soul. From time to time, riders appeared on the horizon. Not with hostility, but as silent messengers of respect. A feather left on his fence post, a pouch of herbs placed on his porch, a quiet sign that he was no longer unseen. The Apaches had not made him one of their own, nor had the townsfolk fully embraced him again, but Elias had carved a place between two worlds. It was lonely, yes, but it was honest. For the first time in his life, he felt that his choices, painful and costly though they were, had meant something greater than himself. Nantan healed slowly under the care of her people. Rumors drifted back through Luzia Caraway that she spoke often of the cowboy who had given his horse and nearly his life. She called him the man who saw worth, a phrase that humbled Elias more than any medal or reward could have. Though their paths did not cross again often, he knew their bond remained, silent but unbroken, carried in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire. It was proof that even in a land divided by blood and suspicion, mercy could plant a seed that endured. The townsfolk, too, shifted in time. Jed Crow still spat when Elias walked by, but others no longer turned their backs. Some even tipped their hats again, quietly acknowledging that the man they once branded a traitor had prevented bloodshed that might have spilled into every ranch and home. Marshal Briggs never apologized, but he stopped speaking his name with contempt. In a place where grudges ran as deep as riverbeds, that was as close to forgiveness as a man could expect. On the anniversary of that fateful night, Elias rode a new horse to the ridge overlooking the desert. He carried no rifle, no armor of pride, only a single white feather tucked into his hatband, left for him months before. As the sun dipped low, painting the land in shades of fire and gold, he felt the weight of what had been won and what had been lost. It wasn't victory in the way most men measured it. It was something quieter, but far more enduring. He sat there until the stars bled through the sky, the desert stretching endless around him. And in that stillness, Elias whispered the truth he had carried all along. Sometimes, in the West, the fastest draw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first. The words faded into the night, carried by the wind, a promise etched into the land itself. And with that, Elias McCord finally rose, a man scarred but whole, knowing he had left his mark on both sides of the desert story.